Frank Morrison had worked San Diego Harbor for 25 years, seeming like any ordinary Port Authority manager controlling ship traffic. Nobody recognized his voice until that day when he gave commands during a terror threat. Young SEALs froze when they heard him speak and automatically snapped to attention because that voice belonged to the legendary commander who saved them from death in training camp 20 years ago. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we begin this incredible story of a harbor master whose commanding voice once led the world's most elite warriors into impossible missions, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that true leaders never stop serving, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who guide others from the shadows. Frank Morrison's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for 25 years. By 5 a.m. sharp, he was walking through the gates of San Diego Harbor Authority, thermos of black coffee in hand, wearing the same practical uniform that marked him as just another port official. At 68, Frank had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades around saltwater and diesel engines. His gray hair was always perfectly trimmed, his posture remained straight despite his age, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing that happened in his domain. To the longshoremen, truck drivers, and ship captains who worked the harbor, he was simply the guy who made sure everything ran on schedule. Frank's office sat in Port Authority Building C, overlooking the main commercial docks where container ships from across the Pacific unloaded their cargo. His desk was military precise, files organized alphabetically, radio equipment positioned at exact angles, coffee mug always in the same spot. Co-workers joked that Frank was the most organized man in California. What they didn't know was that Frank Morrison wasn't really Frank Morrison. His morning routine started with checking overnight shipping manifests, coordinating with Coast Guard patrol schedules, and reviewing security protocols for incoming vessels. But Frank also did something else, something that would have seemed strange if anyone had noticed. Every morning at exactly 5:15 a.m., he conducted a tactical assessment of the harbor. Exit routes, sight lines, defensive positions, potential threat vectors, old habits from his previous life died hard. Tuesday, September 12th began like any other day. The morning fog was just lifting from San Diego Bay as Frank reviewed the schedule for incoming vessels. 3 container ships from Asia, 2 Navy destroyers returning from deployment, and a cruise ship filled with tourists heading to Cabo San Lucas. Frank coordinated traffic from his radio station, his voice calm and professional as he guided massive ships through the harbor channel. The young Coast Guard operators who worked with him daily had grown accustomed to his precise communications, his ability to manage complex vessel movements without ever seeming stressed. Harbor Control to Maersk Valencia, you are cleared for Pier 12, berth north side, tugboat standing by. Copy Harbor Control, Maersk Valencia proceeding to Pier 12. Frank made notes in his logbook, updated the traffic board, and prepared for the next arrival. It was methodical, predictable work that had kept him busy and anonymous for a quarter century. At 10:30 a.m., his radio crackled with an unusual transmission. Harbor Control, this is Coast Guard Cutter Steadfast. We have a situation developing. Request immediate harbor lockdown protocol. Frank's blood pressure spiked, but his voice remained steady. Coast Guard Steadfast, Harbor Control copies, nature of situation. Harbor Control, we have reports of suspicious activity on incoming vessel Sierra 74. Possible security threat, requesting all civilian traffic hold position. Frank's fingers moved to his keyboard, pulling up the vessel tracking system. Sierra 74 was the cargo ship Pacific Dawn, a mid-sized freighter registered in Panama, currently approaching the outer harbor. Coast Guard Steadfast, Harbor Control initiating lockdown. All vessels hold current position. But as Frank coordinated the harbor shutdown, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, assessing the situation with instincts that had nothing to do with managing civilian ship traffic. Within 20 minutes, San Diego Harbor had transformed from a busy commercial port into a potential combat zone. Coast Guard cutters positioned themselves around the Pacific Dawn, their crews visible on deck with weapons ready. Police boats circled at a distance, while FBI and Homeland Security vehicles streamed onto the Harbor Authority docks. Frank watched from his office window as federal agents established a command post in the parking lot below. Through his radio, he could hear multiple agencies trying to coordinate their response, their communications growing increasingly chaotic as more players joined the operation. That's when Frank noticed something that made his skin crawl. A second vessel, a smaller boat that hadn't been on any manifest, was approaching the harbor from the southeast. It was running without lights, staying close to the coastline, clearly trying to avoid detection by the authorities focused on the Pacific dawn. Frank grabbed his binoculars, the same Steiner tactical optics he'd carried during his previous career. Through the lenses, he could see figures moving on the smaller boat's deck and the distinctive outline of equipment that definitely wasn't fishing gear. The Pacific dawn was a distraction. The real threat was the boat nobody was watching. Frank reached for his radio, then stopped. Protocol demanded he contact the Coast Guard through official channels, but by the time his warning worked its way through the chain of command, the small boat would have reached its target. Instead, Frank opened a desk drawer and retrieved a radio that officially didn't exist. Bravo 6 Actual, this is Anchor, priority traffic. The response came immediately. Anchor, this is Bravo 6 Actual, go ahead. Bravo 6, I have eyes on secondary threat vessel bearing southeast approximately 800 meters from harbor entrance. Multiple personnel, probable hostile intent. There was a brief pause, then, Anchor, confirmed visual on secondary vessel. How did you... wait. Anchor, is this who I think it is? Frank smiled grimly. Even after 20 years, the SEAL community remembered call signs. Bravo 6, we can catch up later. Right now you have 2 threats, not 1. The cargo ship is your distraction. The real package is coming in from the southeast. Copy that, Anchor. Redirecting assets now. Through his window, Frank watched as 2 Coast Guard patrol boats peeled away from the Pacific dawn and raced toward the smaller vessel. But he could see it wasn't going to be enough. The boat was too close, moving too fast, and the Coast Guard units weren't in position to intercept. Frank grabbed his other radio, the official Harbor Authority frequency, and keyed the microphone. All units, this is Harbor Control. Emergency directive. Coast Guard vessel Dolphin 7, alter course to bearing 170, full speed. Intercept unknown vessel approaching from southeast. Harbor Control, this is Dolphin 7. We don't have authorization for... Frank's voice cut through the radio chatter with an authority that hadn't been heard in San Diego Harbor for 25 years. Dolphin 7, this is a direct order. Lives are at stake. Execute immediately. The transformation was instantaneous. Frank's voice, calm, commanding, absolutely certain, cut through the confusion like a blade. Every military and law enforcement unit in the harbor had heard that tone before, in training, in briefings, in the moments before dangerous missions. Copy Harbor Control, came the immediate response from Dolphin 7, altering course, full speed. But the real shock came from inside Frank's own building. Jesus Christ, whispered a voice from the doorway. Commander Morrison? Frank turned to see Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, a young SEAL officer who'd been coordinating with Harbor Authority on security protocols. She stood frozen in his doorway, staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and awe. You're supposed to be dead, she said quietly. I got better, Frank replied, then keyed his radio again. Bravo 6, Anchor. Secondary vessel is attempting to ram the cruise ship. You have approximately 90 seconds to intercept. More voices began filling the radio channels as word spread through the military units. Did someone say Commander Morrison? Anchor? That's impossible. He's been gone for 20 years. Holy shit, is that really him? Frank ignored the chatter and focused on coordinating the response. Through his binoculars, he could see the small boat accelerating toward the cruise ship Paradise Queen, which was anchored in the outer harbor with 3,000 civilians aboard. Dolphin 7, you're not going to make it. Break off and take position between the threat vessel and the cruise ship. Force them to alter course. Harbor Control, that's a ramming maneuver. We could... Dolphin 7. Frank's voice carried the weight of 3 decades of command experience. Trust me. What happened next would be studied by maritime security experts for years to come. Frank Morrison, sitting in his Harbor Authority office, orchestrated a complex tactical operation using nothing but radio communications and 30 years of operational experience. He guided Coast Guard vessels into a coordinated intercept pattern, directed police boats to establish blocking positions, and managed civilian ship traffic to keep them clear of the combat zone. Most importantly, he read the tactical situation with the eyes of someone who'd spent decades thinking 3 moves ahead of enemies who wanted to kill him. When the hostile vessel tried to evade the Coast Guard intercept by cutting behind a container ship, Frank was ready. Bravo 6, target will emerge from behind Maersk Valencia in 15 seconds, bearing 090. Adjust intercept accordingly. How the hell do you know that, Anchor? Because I can see everything from up here, and I've been reading enemy movement patterns since before you were born. The intercept was textbook perfect. Coast Guard and SEAL units converged on the hostile vessel from 3 directions, leaving no escape route. When the boat's crew realized they were trapped, they attempted to detonate whatever explosive device they'd been carrying. It failed to ignite. Bravo 6, threat neutralized. All hostiles in custody. Outstanding work, people. The harbor fell silent except for the sound of waves against the docks and the distant hum of helicopter rotors. Frank set down his radio and looked out at the scene below, where federal agents were securing the area and military personnel were conducting post-operation procedures. For the first time in 20 years, Frank Morrison felt like himself again. Within an hour, Frank's office was filled with people he hadn't seen in decades, SEAL officers who'd served under his command, Coast Guard officials who'd heard stories about him, FBI agents who'd read classified files with his name on them. They stood around his Harbor Authority desk like supplicants before a throne, waiting for him to explain how a supposedly dead legend had been hiding in plain sight for 25 years. "Commander," Lieutenant Commander Chen spoke for the group, "we thought you were killed in Somalia." The official report said what they needed to say," Frank interrupted quietly. "Sometimes the best way to serve your country is to disappear completely." Captain James Rodriguez, a SEAL team leader who'd been one of Frank's students 2 decades earlier, stepped forward. "Sir, we need to know, are you still active? Is this some kind of deep cover operation?" Frank smiled and gestured around his modest office with its harbor schedules and shipping manifests and civilian radio equipment. "Does this look like deep cover to you, Captain? I'm exactly what I appear to be, a retired officer who found a second career making sure ships don't run into each other. But the way you handled today's operation was the result of 30 years of training and a ringside seat to watch it unfold, nothing more." Frank stood and walked to his window, looking out at the harbor where normal operations were slowly resuming. Container ships were moving toward their berths, cruise passengers were returning to their vacation, and the sun was setting over San Diego Bay, exactly as it had for 25 years. "Gentlemen," he said without turning around, "some of us serve in uniform, some of us serve in silence, and some of us serve by making sure the ordinary world keeps functioning. Today those worlds intersected. Tomorrow, they probably won't." He turned back to face them. "I trust that's understood." The next morning, Frank Morrison's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for 25 years. By 5 a.m. sharp, he was walking through the gates of San Diego Harbor Authority, thermos of black coffee in hand, wearing the same practical uniform that marked him as just another port official. But something had changed. The young Coast Guard operators who worked with him daily now listened to his radio communications with different ears. When Frank gave course corrections or traffic instructions, they heard the voice of someone who'd once commanded the most elite military units in the world. The harbor workers who'd known him for decades began noticing details they'd overlooked before. The way Frank moved through the docks, always aware of his surroundings. The way he positioned himself in meetings, automatically controlling sight lines and exit routes. The way he spoke, not like a civil servant, but like someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Frank's phone rang more often now, old colleagues checking in, military historians wanting interviews, Pentagon officials suggesting he might consider returning to active duty. He declined them all politely, but the harbor authority's security procedures quietly became more robust. Emergency response protocols were updated with input from someone who'd written the manual on maritime security. Communication systems were upgraded to include frequencies that officially didn't exist. 6 months after the incident, San Diego Harbor was recognized as the most secure major port on the West Coast. Maritime security experts attributed the improvement to enhanced coordination between civilian and military authorities and innovative communication protocols. What they didn't mention was the 68-year-old harbor master who'd been quietly implementing those innovations for 25 years, long before anyone realized who he really was. Frank Morrison continued his morning routine, coordinating ship traffic and managing the mundane logistics that kept one of America's busiest ports functioning. But now, when young military personnel visited the harbor authority, they often found reasons to stop by his office, not for official business, but to stand in the presence of a legend. Sometimes they asked for advice. Sometimes they just wanted to hear him speak, to confirm that the voice that had once guided them through impossible missions was real and still watching over them. Frank always made time for these visits, offering coffee and listening to their stories. But he never spoke about Somalia, or the classified operations that had made him a legend, or the reasons he'd chosen to disappear into civilian life. Because some secrets are kept not to protect the past, but to preserve the future. And some guardians serve best when the world forgets they exist. This has been Hidden Legends, where extraordinary people disguise themselves as ordinary neighbors, waiting for the moment their unique skills are needed most. If this story moved you, share it to honor those who protect us from the shadows. Subscribe for more incredible stories of hidden heroes, and tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone who was much more than they appeared? Because sometimes the person managing your harbor traffic is the same person who once navigated the world's most dangerous waters to keep you safe.